So welcome to my little mini tutorial here. I'm going to try to make this as quick as I possibly can. Perchance I may have to put this on YouTube because depending on how this subject goes. So I wanted to kind of talk a little bit about how the spectrum in works. And the reason being is because I've kind of come into this kind of eureka moment and kind of understanding of how this all comes together. Initially, I wanted to find ways to improve the way in which I adjust my ability to control my audio reactivity through the actual spectrum, through the spectrum in node. The spectrum in node actually has 1024 values of audio reactivity, from your lows of bass to your midtones and then to your highs. Typically, your highs at the end of the 1024 spectrum are not being hit because it's just there's not an awful lot of in music terms, those particular that part of the spectrum is not typically used. But that being said, when I went into this, I thought, oh, I could just divide 1024 into 3 and then I'd be able to see it. No problem. Piece of cake. I got this in the bag. It wasn't as simple as I thought it would be. I found a couple different things that caused some issues as far as like trying to figure out like how this all works. I initially thought that this sequence, that this number basically divided up the 1024 and that was the sequence that was being outputted. I have since realized what is actually going on and how they correlate to each other, or how these three nodes correlate to each other. I'm starting to now understand that the size is the size of like your spectrum that you're taking. So if you only take three bars of that spectrum, you're going to get basically three pieces of collection. You're going to get three pieces of notes. So it's a 0 to 1 value for all 1024 collections. So if I were to click this button, you'll notice that when I highlight over it, it'll say that there are 1024 values. You don't technically see those 1024 values, but if you go to this read value, I have it set to 32 currently, right? So in 32, the sequence is telling you, okay, these are the generic numbers that it sets up, but basically it goes from 0 to 31 because 0 is counted as 1. So they're at 32 values. So I'm basically saying my size of isolation is 32, but it starts from left to right. So in this particular case, it's basically saying I'm grabbing the 32 values left to right at the base, basically is what it's doing. Okay, because I'm telling it to begin at 0. This part took me quite a bit of time to kind of understand how this all works, as I was trying to figure out a way to slide this through, because I wanted to be able to choose how many values I'm selecting, right? So if I wanted, for instance, 55 values, how would I know where I start? And I wanted to be able to control this. And at first I thought, oh well, I could just put those numbers in and it'll be a piece of cake. All I got to do is just basically divide my numbers. And I thought the sequence, the size was the size of like a chunk. And I'm realizing now that was the error of my ways. I'm not basically selecting a chunk. Well, technically I sort of am, but for the intensive purposes in this particular case, I'm grabbing a sequence of numbers, and I'm starting from, I'm saying basically my size of the sequence of numbers in the collection is 32, and I want to begin that size of collection at a specific number. The step at the very end, I actually thought this step meant you would divide that number, and that would be basically your chunks would be collected, and then the step was to basically tell it how many selections you want to take, and that's not the case. The step is basically if you had, like, for instance, let's say you had a collection of 1 to 8, right? And we can do that. If I do a linear, okay, here's a linear, and the minimum is 0 and the maximum is 1, so it's a 0 to 1 value. And if I change that to 8, you'll notice that I have a collection of 8 values, and it's a float, which means that they're decimal numbers, okay? I can change this probably to an integer. There we go. And then I could set this to 8. And then what will happen is it'll go 0 through 8, right? 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And the reason being is because I'm basically telling it this is my new collection. Okay, so let's set this one aside for just 1 second. We're trying to simplify this a little bit. My linear is basically nothing more than a collection of numbers from 0 to 1 or 0 to 8. Okay, I am basically saying when I use the sequence how many I want to pull. So in this sequence, let's say I want to pull the first 2, and I want to start that begin sequence on the third number in the sequence, which would be 2, right? Third number in the sequence is 2. So I'm basically saying I want 2 values. I want the value to start at 3. And then the step is like if you wanted odd or even numbers, it could be like 3s, 4s, so on and so forth. So it's a way of us to just step into a specific number. And I'll show that in just 1 second, but let's go through this real quick. If I enter in a read, if I add in a read node, and I basically tell it this is my sequence, or this is my set of numbers, and then, or my collection, excuse me, and then I say I want to add this as my index, it's basically saying I want to see this as my numbers. So then it's selecting 3 and 4, okay, and the step is 1. So 3 and 5 are my values. If I go here, you'll notice 3 and 4, because I'm beginning at 3, so 3 and 5 are I'm beginning at 3, so my 2 values are 3 and 5. So now the read value says 0 and 1 are 3 and 5. And this particular part took me way too long to understand how that particular thing works. This is how you could select your mids, your highs, and your lows. However, you would need to know how big your spectrum is and where you want your mids, your highs, and your lows to start and stop. And that particular part I will do in a different video. But this is the general gist of it. Right at this moment, I haven't broken it down completely. Right at this moment, I just have a series of 32 values, which I'm using or calling at this moment the base, right? So I did the same. Using a linear, however, I'm using a spectrum, okay? And the spectrum is the value that's coming in. I'm telling the sequence to begin at 0, okay? And the step is 1. And the reason why the step is 1 is because I don't want, first of all, in this particular case, I don't really need the step. I don't want the step. I only want just those 32 values, and I can start at a beginning range, but in this particular case, I don't even really need a range. I just wanted to basically select the first 32. And so what I did was I selected the first 32. I remapped my numbers. So in this particular case, I'm saying any of these values is from 0 to 0.25. And I want to remap those numbers so that they go from negative to 1. And negative 0.5 is up here. I'm using that in my transform to bump these squares up, right? So from negative 0.5, which is down here this is a Cartesian coordinate, right? In that coordinate, I'm basically saying that this start at negative 5, which is down here, and as the spectrum in is reading those numbers, basically I'm saying this is now the 0 to 1 value. Remap that 0 to 1 value as -5 to 1, and it's giving the numbers in between. So now what I'm basically doing is I'm creating that batch of numbers. Okay, and I'll show you what this looks like in the end in a second. The average is basically taking all 32 numbers, adding them all together, and dividing by 32. So I'm basically telling it, like we used to do in math, basically I'm creating an average of all 32 numbers together. And then what I'm doing is then I'm taking that and putting it into the y value so that the green, okay, basically changes to the green changes the transform here, right? So this is before the colorize, right? So basically I'm saying this is big rectangle. I want it to start here and use this singular value to change this one rectangle. And then what's happening is it's going to output the average of all those pieces together. And that looks like this. So I'm going to play a little bit of music. I'm going to turn this down because I don't need a copyright strike on this. But if I play the music, this is what happens. Right? So the average is not as high as the rest of them. Okay. So, and I'm going to stop that. So that kind of gives you an idea as to how this all works. I'm basically taking the average to all the red numbers that are going up and down, and I'm averaging them out into the green one. And I can make a selection based on that sequence. So I tell the sequence how big the number is and where to begin. And this is how I could get the highs, the midtones, the bass, the midtones, and the highs. Because there's 1024 values, one of the things that they suggest is not to use all 1024. I thought that if I used 1024, it wouldn't be an issue. Even with my higher end computer, 1024 values is not necessarily a problem for 1024 per se. Like putting 1024 squares on the screen it multiple times. That's where I run into issues. I ran into that issue when I started increasing my size isolation value. You'll notice down here my sequence is 128, and that's all for the white squares, right? So if I go over here, you'll notice there's 128 squares. That's what 128 squares looks like. But then when I also put 128 squares on top of that and made them red, the system didn't quite like that so much. So I kind of narrowed it down a little bit more. But you'll notice that even 43 squares, right? So it's able to select those, make a selection. And that's how this all kind of came to be. This is, I think there are parts of this that can be complicated once you understand how the collections work and then how to make these linear collections here. That helps out a great deal. Linear can be used in multiple places, and I have used it in multiple places. In this particular case, for instance, here's my rectangle. I'm defining the shape and size of the rectangle, and then here I'm transforming that rectangle. But you'll notice a series of rectangles here. It's not just one rectangle, and the reason being is because in this span, I'm basically telling it span is very similar to a sequence. The difference is it doesn't have the option for step, but it's a very kind of similar kind of thing. You're basically selecting a specific span of numbers. That's why it's called span, right? So then, in this particular case, I'm taking that read of is that 32? No, it's 43. I'm taking the read of those 43, and I'm putting that span into, sorry, I'm getting in the weeds here. I've taken this sequence. Let's start here. I'm sorry. This sequence down here is the 128. I told it the size is 128 to the linear so that I didn't have to type that number in manually. I'm basically saying, what is the size of this sequence? And this is the sequence of numbers, right? And it's 128. So it takes that value and says 128 is the amount of that size. And then I can take that and put it into a linear. This particular linear here is actually so that I can make the squares going across the screen, right? So what I'm doing in this particular case, here's 128. I'm basically saying the x values go from negative 1.5, which is over here, to 1.5. And I want 128 squares. And it basically, the linear will basically put even space in between those squares. And that's basically how that works. But I'm also telling the system, once you make those 128 squares, I want a selection beginning at 0 of 32 squares, 43 squares at the very beginning. And I want to use this, I want to do the same thing. So here I have 128, and here I only have 43. And it's telling the system, I only want the first 43. And because this linear carries the data of not only the size, but also the values of each x value, right? So the first 43, this is the x value of from negative 1.5 to, that would probably be negative 1.15 or close or somewhere in there, 1.2, right? So it's basically telling the system that's where I want to select those. So if I highlight over this one, you'll notice that here are our values. The negative 5 is where it starts down here, and the numbers that you saw, the numbers that you saw in this list them from left to right, right? So negative 1.5 to all the way to negative 1.16 ish. There's more to that, but that it spaces them out evenly. So I don't have to do the calculations to that. Linear does that for me, or the span does that for me. And then what I do is I put that into my transform, I colorize it, and then I just join the two together. That's basically what I'm doing here, is I'm joining actually the 3 together, because this is the average one, which is just one singular value, one collection, and it's going into the y value. I'm basically telling it it's this y value, increase or move this up and down based on this one y value. Excuse me. And then the rest of this is just order. So this transform is the red values, this transform is the green values, and this transform is the white values, and I join them together. And that's what creates that particular look or a particular patch. Hopefully that was helpful, or gave you an idea as to how this all goes together. I can do some really great things with this. It's not just a scale left to right where you're just moving the notches up and down. This was to help me kind of understand how it all goes together. My plan now is to make a range of numbers and be able to scale that range of numbers. And when I scale that range of numbers, the value for, let's say, the bass to midtone, if I scale that, instead of I want the average of 32 values, I want the average of 24 values. I want my midtone value to also change accordingly. And some of that is just basically making sure that my values, when one value changes, the other value changes. And I think I have an idea as to how I can do that, but I'll make another patch for that. And test it out, and then kind of report back on that particular process. So to kind of give an example as to how that works. There are some really great things, however, that I've been working on that this really helps with. I'm going to give an example here. I'm just going to turn off this volume so that you can't hear the music. And if I play the music, I'm going to go back here and we're just going to play this. You'll see this is what it looks like, right? But if I close this spectrum out, this was my other initial setup values. Hang on, this one. Okay, this was the initial idea of how to set up that, and I thought, oh, then this is where I kind of broke it down, and I thought this is how this works. I can just change the values, and that would make it so that I have 32 values. But what I'm realizing is my line count is the actual, those are the values, right? So if I add in 12 values here, it's just those 12 shapes, right? Just the outline shapes. This was the first example of this, and now that I know that that's not how FFT works, as far as these values down here at the bottom, now I need to make changes in my own patches to make that work, to reflect how it's really supposed to work. But this was a perfect example of something that I can use it for, is this audio reactivity based on my music. And this makes for a really nice effect on Saturday weekends. I really enjoy this effect. Here's another example, right? This is, and see if I can find a better song with a little bit more bass to it. But it gives you an example as to what that looks like. And then it really kind of gives a nice effect. But then I've also started working on a new one, which is this spectrum size node. And so this is also FFT based, right? Echo shape spectrum ring. So this is the same effect. It's just one's on the inside of the ring and one's on the outside. And it's just a different way of setting it up. Spectrum. And there's the third ring that I created. With a little bit of trail, just so that it gives it a little extra time on the screen and adds a little extra zhuzh. So yeah, I think this is really kind of coming along. This is the kind of thing that I'd like to see more of in my videos. I'm trying my hardest to figure out ways to make it a little bit more visually interesting, and I think by understanding how external FFT works, not just the FFT, the spectrum in works. Just a heads up, if you made it this far, thank you for watching this video and listening to me yammer on. But to give you an example, here's just one layer, that's just that one ring. If I'm here at spectrum in and I turn this to local, it turns it off completely, right? And if I turn it on to composition, there's nothing, I don't have any composition set up. But external FFT, which is my microphone, or in this particular case, I actually have a line into my microphone, so it goes directly to the line in goes directly into Resolume. I use a program called Voice Meter to basically pipe in my direct audio from my music program of choice into like a line one, and then it uses Resolume uses that line one as my external as my microphone basically. So then I'm not using my microphone to make those sounds, which is great because then I have basically a direct input from my music instead of a direct input from my microphone, which may receive pops or hisses or other external noises. It'll be picked up by the microphone, and in this particular case I don't have to worry about that. To give it another example, this is a very kind of simple and basic one. It was the same kind of premise. I actually was using this to like change the values of light, right? So from 1 to 0 values is the same thing in contrast of colors. and brightness and contrast is based on that same kind of 0 to 1 value. And so these are like gradient level bars that are being moved. It's been kind of modified. I actually have a slide that has visuals. He's a fantastic artist, and I use some of his stuff that the patch really looks like. And then I have options to change the color and whatnot. But again, another patch that I'm going to be improving upon now that I know how the external FFT works and how it pulls those numbers. This is just a perfect example. Like, I'm probably just pulling the first 15 numbers, which is just the base. Which, now that I'm looking at it, I'm like, okay, well, now I know. And in any case, thank you for watching my very long video. I appreciate your time. If you'd like to see more about this, or are interested in these kinds of things, let me know in the comments. I read them as soon as I can. And thanks very much for watching, and I'll talk to you guys soon. Thanks. Bye.